Good evening, everyone. My name is Philip Reger, and I want to welcome you to December 5th, 2023's board workshop. Today, we're going to begin our conversations around our budget and some of the implications as it relates to the ending of some ESSER funding. With that being said, I want to turn it over to the superintendent and her team to walk us through the next couple of, I know they have some slides, but walk us through the next 60 to 90 minutes of, again, from a budget perspective. Superintendent?
Thank you and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here for another one of our budget conversations. I begin by recognizing that this year's budget process, it is going to be challenging. So the opportunity to continue to share information as we're kind of going through the process is important for all of us. I also encourage those of you that are either here with us tonight or those that are, watching at a later time. We do have our website and have all of the, recordings, the documents. We continue to share those in our weekly communications to families. Again, trying to ensure that everyone is informed throughout the process. From a process and agenda perspective, so let me just give a quick overview. We'll start with reviewing our priorities, the current situation, if you will, process, and then feedback that we've gathered from stakeholders thus far. We know that we're going to continue to hear from stakeholders. Then we'll review the historical context, right? Where were we? How have we gotten to where we are today? And specific details as to what is contributing to our projected deficit and fixed costs, right? I'm highlighting the word projected because, right, this is a moving target as we kind of go through and considering all the options that we have. And then we'll do a preview of some preliminary reductions and open it for some dialogue. And suggestion, Chairman, is to hold questions until the end, so that you all can hear the full picture and reserve as much time as possible for a conversation. Does that sound like a plan to you?
Yeah, I think given the content of the information, it's best that we get through the content as much as possible. And then again, to your point, leave questions for towards the end.
Great.
Again, I guess to my colleagues as we're going through the slides, please make note of your questions for later in the presentation.
Great, and I will tag you in, Deputy Foster, at some points throughout the presentation. So for all of those that are with us, this slide should be familiar, right? It is the overview of our district model for excellence and our operating plan, our strategic operating plan, which is now in the final of 3 years, and it is the plan that we were anchoring in to not only promote academic and emotional recovery, but keeping in mind that we were leveraging those ESSER COVID relief funding throughout the process. And the plan, right, is comprised of those 4 major priorities that you see here, of course, to support the whole student. And this is essentially what has driven us forward over the last couple of years. And since we know that recovery for our students is not where we want it to be, we know that it will continue to guide us in years ahead. So on the left here, a quick reminder again of those 4 priorities. Priority 1, making sure that our students have access to high quality teaching and learning, right? Focusing specifically on rigorous, culturally responsive curriculum and instruction, followed by our other priority, which is around ensuring that our students, adults, families, partners, experience a welcoming culture and a nurturing climate, so that we can create systems of support to promote our student engagement. Priority 3 is cultivating partnerships with our families and with our community so that we can collectively improve outcomes for our students. And then priority 4 is the main focus of tonight's conversation, right? Which includes ensuring long-term financial sustainability. And more importantly, I want to note that we've outlined proposed district model of excellence aligned priorities for next school year, which are even more focused as we face, right, tightening of those available revenue, and yet, we still have the same level of need, right? The concentration of need does not change. The revenue that comes in is changing. So we feel that these buckets, if you will, are most important to promote short-term gains while also establishing that foundation for long-term improvement and achievement, like that of early literacy, for example, all through the lens of limited financial resources. So I'm going to do an aerial view. This is the financial situation that we're currently trying to work through. And I want to make it very, very clear. So I want you to hear me that these are preliminary numbers. And in some spaces, we are using estimates. And we are also presenting the worst case scenario. We know that it's early in the process, but we want everyone to understand the complexities that we need to solve for. This assumes that we are 100% staffed next year and that we continue with 100% of the goods, the programs, the services that we invested in this year, right? I don't mean, this is not within the spirit of scaring anyone, but we do need to take it very seriously, the current situation that we're in. So projected revenue for next year, 24-25, is $417 million, which is essentially has been flat for the last 6 years. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And if we want to maintain the same level of programming next year that we have this current school year, we would accumulate approximately 517 million in expenses, right? So you see there, right, that there is a gap. There are various aspects of that level of expenses that we're gonna, walk through and unpack a little bit later. But the result, right, high level overall, is $100 million deficit, which it does include ESSER. And it is important that we all understand the scale of the challenge so that we can all participate openly in developing a solution. But also, it's important to note that, this is not new to Hartford Public Schools. The deficit is indeed larger, never been in this situation before. The cliff is more severe, right? We have had to navigate, budget gaps in the past. It is, though, the difference is the current gap. So let me just give you a reminder as to where we've been, right, in that position in the past. To have to navigate mitigation is not new to our district, and of course other urban, communities as well. But it's a problem that we haven't had to face to the same degree over the last few years because of that infusion of federal pandemic relief funding, and increased flexibility that historically has not been available to us. So this table, as you can see, shows at the top level summary of recent historical challenges that we've faced as a district, and we have had to mitigate. In one way to mitigate was with reductions in positions in labor. Mitigation included reduction in staff at the schools, throughout schools, and at central office, reduction in staff and programming throughout. And during those years, we were intentional in using, vacancies and attrition from turnover, right? People that, would take on, leadership roles or transition out to retirement, right? We leveraged those to eliminate roles. And in each of those years, with the exception of 16, 17, when we consolidated a number of schools, right, the proportionate impact on staff was greater for central office. than it was, than it was for schools, which, also reflected intentional decision making at the time. And I think it's also important for us to understand that there has been consistent budget mitigation that's necessary because of the systemic challenges, and that right, we've pursued strategies of reducing staff as a result. And there's not an incredible amount of excess to reduce without making incredibly difficult decisions and rethinking current structures. And because our current budget situation is even more challenging and more complex than previous years, due to that sunsetting of ESSER funding, and an accumulation of, right, we've moved up. So what we wanted to do is kind of move the process up earlier so that it allows us more opportunity to really grapple with, the complexity of it and engage stakeholders throughout the process. So you just see here an aerial view of specific components of our budget development process and current status of, right, where we are in this timeline. And I think it also gives a visual of a more comprehensive approach that we're taking with developing the budget, and the various groups that we want to stay engaged throughout the development of the budget, right? SGCs, union leadership, board members, our families. One of the most important aspects of that approach is stakeholder engagement and feedback and perspective. And so I'll kind of give you a glance into what we have been hearing thus far. Again, right, there's more that will be added here, but here's a summary of some of the feedback from some of the touch points with specific stakeholders, right? So our SGC forum on November 8th, participants lifted questions around, tutoring opportunities and supports, just general staffing implications now that, right, ARP ESSER funding was sunsetting, investments in unified arts, and how they could be more involved in the budget process as either parents or caregivers. Our school leaders, right, in these were different sessions with our principals and assistant principals, talked about reducing the number of centralized coaches. They also discussed, opportunities to share resources across schools and perhaps gaining, efficiencies in underutilized facilities, and ways in which we could reduce out of district placements. Yesterday we had our meeting with some of the union leaders, a quarterly union meeting, and those that joined us, they talked about sharing resources as well and maintaining certain investments like unified arts. They also raised, possibility for, flexible schedules. How do we leverage our partners? And also suggestion for reducing non-certified school-based staff, and right, shifting those responsibilities to teachers. An example that we heard was around, engaging with families, and that should be, that is a function of a teacher, is what we heard from our union leaders. This pie chart represents the allocation of the district budget. And it might be a slightly different from a previous pie charts that you might have seen. So we have removed the pandemic relief funds, ESSER, from the 23-24 budget allocation so that we can better understand the available resources that we'll have next year. And also because you see a significant increase in school and central office allocations with ESSER. So then, if you look closely, you'll see now that about 45% of our budget is indirect, direct school-based expenses. Out of the remainder, another 30 of the budget allocation goes toward transportation and tuition payments, right, that we make to other school districts, costs that are essentially right out of our control. 12% is allocated for special education, the vast majority of which is determined right by student need. And we're looking then at 6.4 allocated for central office budgeted expenditures. But even within that 6.4, a portion of those costs represent school-based staff that are paid out of a central office budget. But all central office departments, right, finance and talent, performance management, operations, communications, they all provide support to schools for their own, operations. Right, so we just took a look at our allocations without ESSER. So this is a reminder of what ESSER has and is funding this school year. Right, so 230 positions in our district are funded with ESSER, positions that are, incremental to the equity-based budget positions that we reviewed, right, that we also have as part of our budget. And these include, staff responsible, for example, for social emotional supports, social workers, classroom paraeducators. In the area of instruction, that includes 35 resource teachers, coaches, and over 16 teachers hired to reduce class size. And it includes over 16 student engagement specialists, 3 family and community support service providers who have all been at the center of our efforts to re-engage students and improve attendance throughout the district. The programming is listed on the left side of the slide, right under non-staff. And we see, the range from extracurricular and extended learning opportunities, esports, tech-based enrichment, high school career pathways that we know are proven to be successful in helping our students in preparing for college and career readiness, and that our students keep reminding us that they want more of. So this is, why we're going to have to make some really, really difficult decisions moving forward on behalf of students and staff, because of the important work that staff members have done and the important benefits from those programmatic investments, right? We caution against mitigating a deficit by simply just saying, okay, all the ESSER positions, let's just remove all of them, right? We need to pause and really think through. And so, we have to be overly intentional and strategic in all of our trade-offs, because, right, a reminder again, we talked about this before, that there will be trade-offs that will have to be made. This chart gives us an overview of revenue for the last 6 school years, including where we are today, as well as a projection of our revenue for the next year. So the bars are dividing into funding buckets, right? So we have private and other, federal, state, local, and ESSER or pandemic relief. So the modest increase in revenue in the middle of the graph, shown in the royal blue, represents that significant investment, right? So with the expiration of those COVID relief funds at the end of this fiscal year, right, we will have almost the exact same amount of revenue in next year that we had in 18-19. Right, so that presents an incredible challenge for us, especially due to inflation, which we have estimated, right? That's the red line that you see. So you'll notice, right, ESSER essentially helped us keep up with inflation. And with the expiration of those ESSER funds, there's now a significant delta between the inflation adjusted revenue and what we are projected to have, what is projected to be our revenue. So, Deputy Foster, I'm gonna tag you in to kind of, tease out some of the details.
Yes, thank you, Superintendent. Good evening, everybody. And so what I'm going to do, as you heard the superintendent say right at the start, we're looking at, and again, I want to reiterate, right? These are our current estimates and our current projections of what is, our best knowledge today of 24-25, and it represents, as the superintendent said, the worst case scenario. So you see here what we already talked about earlier. So anticipating about 417 million in revenue, that's our current projection. And as the superintendent just shared on the previous slide, that relative to not only last year, but the last several years. And on the left-hand side of this chart, what you see is our anticipated cost of maintaining services. So we're calling this is what I'll call the level service budget, right? That 517 million. That means if we were to attempt to continue to do everything in 24-25 that we're doing in 23-24, every position, every expenditure, including those that are currently on ESSER, that's what it would cost us to continue all of the same positions and all of the same programming. That's the 517. So what I want to do next in this graph is talk about, I'll call it the anatomy of the deficit. So what are the components that build to this $100.1 million deficit? Again, worst case scenario, I want to be clear, and based on current projection. But what are the components that lead to this difference between 417 million and 517 million in expenses? So the first thing is ESSER spending. So that's the most obvious one, right? There's in that 517 million, if we were to attempt to continue doing all of the positions and all of the programs we've done this year, there's $51 million in ESSER spending that we won't have that revenue next year, but there's 51 million being spent in 23-24 that is providing positions and providing programs that the superintendent just talked about. The next element of the deficit is the ESSER offset. So you'll recall, I think, from our 23-24 budget process, that one of the conversations we had over several meetings with you as the board and in the community was, can't we use, right, we were trying to solve for a deficit last year, just like we are this year. One of the questions is, how can we leverage ESSER to help offset some of the challenge? And so ultimately, when we were balancing the 23-24 budget, we assumed that we would use about 9.2 million of ESSER to cover expenditures that we otherwise would have covered in another way, or had to cut, I should say. And so that adds to the deficit because we have to solve for that additional 9.2 million that we're planning to use ESSER for in 23-24. So the next element of the deficit is the state legislature had approved a tuition offset grant that provided funding in actually 22-23 to help us balance the 22-23 budget, and that was for tuition over and above a certain dollar amount for for the number of our kids over a certain percentage who were going out of district to charters and charters, magnet, open choice, those kinds of schools out of district. There's a continuation of that into 23-24 to the tune of $3 million. And so we don't, at present, are not anticipating having that funding in 24-25. So again, that becomes a piece of the revenue picture in 23-24 we won't have in 24-25, which makes it another part of our deficit. Okay, so the next piece, again, going back to our 23-24 budget process, we said, okay, we got the deficit down to $2 million in the budget process, and then we decided we're going to build that $2 million into the budget as a budget task that we will solve for during the 23-24 school year. So that's essentially $2 million in expenses that we didn't have the revenue for. We decided, based on things not being expended in the way we planned, we would cover for that over the course of the 23-24 year. The next chunk, right, this is where a structural deficit, you heard the superintendent talk about inflation, right? If our revenues are flat, right, we have contracts with our labor unions that have percentage increases each year. The vendors that we use, whether it's for HVAC maintenance, providing our busing, right, there are increases in those contracts each year. So 13.9 million of that deficit is our current, I want to be clear, this is our current estimate. It could be higher, but is our current estimate based on the best assumptions we can make today around the rising costs for personnel and contracts. And so you see 13.9 million adding to the deficit there. And then the last piece, I think this is our last chunk, we made, and you'll, I think, recall this from our budget conversations as well, in the 23-24 budget, right, we know that we've struggled to fill positions. And so we built into the 23-24 budget an assumption that over the course of the year, we would average 6% of our positions being vacant. Well, and we would recover the spending that would otherwise have been spent paying the salaries and fringe benefits for those positions to cover other costs. So that 6% vacancy rate assumption amounts to $21 million. So that's the anatomy of the deficit, right? So when you talk about 101 or 100.1 million, again, worst case scenario, those are the elements that lead us to being in a place where we have 100 million more in expenses than we have revenue if we are attempting to continue all of the positions and all of the programming that we did in 23-24. So if we go to the next slide, the other piece that's important to this conversation is differentiating between fixed costs and discretionary costs. So the superintendent shared the pie chart with you that showed the different places our budget goes. And in that anticipated $517 million expenditure, again, that's level service, keeping all the same positions, all the same programming. Roughly 216 million of that, and again, current estimate, current projection, is what I would call fixed costs, meaning we have very little control or ability to reduce these costs, right? Utilities, I'm going to work from the bottom up. Utilities, our health clinics, that's in there. It's a very small dollar figure because most of our health clinics are funded off of reimbursements, but utilities, right? Those go up every year with inflation. We all experience that in our own homes, dealing with the inflation with utility prices. So we have to deal with that as a district as well. Our special education costs, there are levers we can have relative to special education. How many of our students are out of district? How many of our students are in district? But at the end of the day, our special education costs are driven by the needs of our young people. And we have to meet the needs that are articulated in our students' IEPs and their 504 plans. And so we have not a lot of ability to influence those numbers. Similarly with transportation. The vast majority of our transportation budget is transportation for our special education students. But even the transportation budget that's for our general education students, we have to get our kids to school, obviously. We have to honor the rules about how far students can walk. And so there's not a lot of ability to control tuition either. And then, of course, tuition, that's driven by family choices about where they're going to send their kids for school. And then we don't have a lot of control over what those places our students go, how much they're charging for tuition, what services they're providing. So if you have 216 million in fixed costs, what that leaves us at the end of the day is 300 million roughly that I would call discretionary. And discretionary, they're not really discretionary. I mean, these are things, we're doing things that we need to do to serve our kids. What I mean when I say discretionary is I mean, when we have about 300 million where we can try to solve for the deficit. And so that's just important because if we're saying our worst case scenario is $100 million deficit, we're not actually able to interact with the entire 500 million in expenditures when trying to close that deficit. We're trying to close that deficit while only working with the 300 million that we can actually influence and change. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to walk through here is there are some opportunities that are easier than others in terms of making choices, but there aren't any really easy choices. But we have certainly forecast over the last few years that this pandemic relief fund cliff was coming. And so folks know that, our principals have known that, our community has known that, this money would not last forever. And we're now at that point, right? This is where we are now. So what we've done here is created a set of potential cuts. Now I want to be really clear. No decisions have been made on any of these cuts yet. This is what we're trying to do here is just illustrate for you how much do certain choices amount to when it comes to closing the gap and closing the deficit. So we'll go ahead and talk through these. I'm going to try to move through these relatively quickly, but I just want to give you a sense of if we make certain choices, how does that solve or help us solve for the deficit? So the first one is probably the easiest one. We did a bunch of things with ESSER that truly are one-time expenses. Where, for example, this year we're spending $1 million on musical instruments. Musical instruments last for more than a year, happily. And so we don't need to buy $1 million in musical instruments in 24-25. And there's other things you see on there, like the curriculum investments that have been made security upgrades that are happening in schools right now, those don't have to be repeated annually. And so that's an easy one, right? That can potentially save us $10 million. You also know we provided the scaling equity and innovation grants to schools. Now, that's not as easy because that is both programming. Some of those contracts have come before you as a board. It also includes some positions where schools have made strategic choices about additional positions that will help them move the needle for their kids post-pandemic. But the total value of those equity integration grants is about $10.8 million. Some of our academic programming and things like staffing incentives, marketing efforts, some of those things that we did pre-pandemic, but we increased them over the course of the pandemic with ESSER funds. If we go back to sort of pre-pandemic levels for some programming, that's about almost $6 million. Now this is again, these are all strategic choices. We have been using ESSER to refresh our one-to-one technology, right? Computers have a 4 or 5 year life cycle. So we've been replacing a percentage of our computers each year. That's been with ESSER funding. Now, we could stop doing that entirely, but then 3 or 4 years from now, we would maybe not even 3 or 4. I would say 2 to 3 years from now, we would be saying we're not able to be a one-to-one district because some of those computers would be getting old. So what you see is we could potentially save $2 million or 1.7 by reducing that annual refresh by 50%. Just as a proxy, and you can change the percentages, but if there was across the board 5% cut at central office, it's about $1.4 million. Another one, I'm going to walk through the equity-based starter budget in a moment, but as you know, we budget based on some formulas, or we allocate staffing based on formulas. Because we've had ESSER, we have had the ability to staff above the formula. If going forward, we could make a choice to staff at the formula as it's written, and that would save us about $11 million. We have been funding full service community schools. That's something that's been a challenge because we see the value in that. We see the value in those wraparound services for our young people in our schools. But it's also another area we forecasted over the years, right? It was reduced this year, 23-24, from what it was in 22-23, anticipating that the ESSER funding cliff was coming. And so if we were to eliminate that funding or find another funding source for full service community schools, that would save $2.5 million. You saw a recommendation on coaching. And so if we reduce coaching to sort of pre-pandemic levels in terms of instructional coaches, it's about 1.4 million. The last one is so schools added a few positions with their equity innovation grants. But as you saw on a slide the superintendent walked through earlier, we also added the district. We made strategic choices to add a bunch of positions to schools, whether that be additional social workers, behavior techs, student engagement specialists, FCSSPs. If we were to eliminate all of those school-based positions that were funded through ESSER, that's about $12 million. So what I want to highlight is I just went through, and I hope I didn't bore you with all of those, but I just went through a series of what are some of the options for closing a gap. But if you look at the graph on the left-hand column, what I want to highlight, we still have a $40 million gap. Like if we said yes to everything you see on the right side of this slide, our current projected, and again, I'll say again, worst case scenario, but our worst case scenario is if we said yes to everything on the right side of this slide, we would be trying to solve for about $40 million. Now, the other thing I can be clear about is we haven't built any vacancy assumptions yet, but we also have to be much more careful about that next year, because the labor market in a post-ESSER funding world will be very different next year. We don't anticipate having the same difficulty filling positions. And so we can't rely on, for example, a 6% or even a 4% vacancy rate in 24-25. So if we go to the next slide, this is just an illustration. So we showed you a pie chart earlier of the allocation of the district budget. This is just an average. This is what a typical school budget looks like. And the main reason we want to show you this slide is it is tempting to think about, well, we want to do, and I would agree with this, we want to stay as far away from cutting positions as possible. But the important thing to know is that 90% of our budget in a typical school, 90% of the budget for that school is positions. And so you can see the other things, the equipment, the services, the supplies are not a huge chunk of that budget. The other thing you see here on this slide is just our maximum class sizes per teacher's contract. Now, obviously, we're not staffing. We're staffing for smaller class sizes than that, but that is what the maximums are as dictated in our current contract with our teachers union. So the last 3 slides I'm going to go through, and I will move through these kind of quickly so we can get to discussion and questions. We just want to remind you of our equity-based starter budget, because this is the starting point for our budget discussions and decision-making. So over these last 2 weeks, we've been having meetings with every school to talk about their budget. And as I said in the earlier slide, because we've had the ability with ESSER, we've been able to staff schools above these formulas. So one of the challenging conversations is for our school leaders, is if we were to return to staffing at the level of the equity-based starter budget, right? How do they make that work in their building? And so I won't go through each of these, but on this first slide, what you see is this is the staffing allocation per student for those positions that we can allocate on a per student basis. So that includes our teachers, and on the call out box on the right, you can see the formula. So for A through 2nd grade, we're allocating to a school 1 teacher for every 18.4 students. And these formulas, we've not changed them in a couple of years. And that is one of the things we have to contemplate in thinking about balancing this budget is, both do we fund and staff exactly at the level of this budget? And also, are there changes we want to make to this budget? So this is your staffing allocations per student. If you go to the next slide, you're seeing non-staff allocations per student. So obviously your supplies, we made a choice a few years ago to add a middle school social emotional learning supplement, just because of the specific social emotional needs of young people in those age ranges. Magnet supplement, and then flexible dollars. And the flexible dollars really, they are very flexible, right? In some cases, schools have actually used some of these dollars to purchase additional positions, but they also can use them for transportation, for field trips. They can use them if they're bringing someone in to do professional learning with their educators. And then the last part of the equity-based starter budget is there's a set of positions as well as costs that aren't as simple as X amount per student. So the most obvious example is special education teachers and paraeducators, where the number allocated to a school is based on the need of the students served by that school. Custodians base it on the size of the facility, the need of the facility, and then on down the list. So we just wanted to, I know you've seen the equity-based starter budget. We just wanted to reiterate that that's a key part of building our budget. And it's one of the things we have to contemplate when we think about balancing the 24-25 budget is, are there changes that we want to contemplate in the equity-based starter budget? And so with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to the superintendent to see if she wants to add anything before we move to questions and discussion.
It's just a double click on the fact that these are preliminary numbers. No decisions have been made, and we're going to continue to get feedback. There was one of the slides that I didn't reference this, but when I shared the trends that we have heard from the engagement with stakeholders, one resonating theme across all of those was the need for advocacy. That, I'm not saying that through advocacy levels and efforts, it's going to net us $100 million, but we know that there's an opportunity there. And I know that, Chairman, there's structures in place to have those conversations with others that might be in similar situations. Regardless of whether the advocacy leads to additional revenue now, we know that we have to continue to do that, because right at the backdrop of it all is still that structural challenge that we have that impedes a healthy financial outlook.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And before I open up to questions, I do think I was going to put in the chat, we should define what advocacy is in this sense, right? I think there's varying ways of advocacy, and I just want to make sure that, again, for public consumption, that there's a working definition as it relates to the budget and what we're talking about tonight.
Yes, so we can shift to questions and discussions, and I just want to remind our team that I do have to hop off at 6:30. I have to introduce one of our students as receiving a leadership award, and she requested that I introduce her. So I'm gonna deliver on that promise. So so that you all don't wonder where I went. But back
Yeah,
to you,
so
Chair, for questions.
yeah, no, thank you for that that heads up, and please send our congratulations and well wishes to that student. That's always great to hear. I guess for me again, my first question is maybe just taking a couple of minutes to define advocacy as it relates to the budget and what we're talking about. Um, right, I know there's micro and macro, and I think what you're asking is more or talking about is more macro. I just want to make sure that folks understand exactly what you mean by advocacy for the budget.
I did get the sense that it was more macro, right? When we heard the question from parents, it was specific to what, tell us the leaders, what leaders do we need to, go to locally and at the state level, to address our concerns. And then, our union leadership in previous meetings have also talked about, the opportunities that exist through the coalition chairman, that the task force and the broader coalition and opportunities with other districts. And so from that lens, I got the sense that it was as it relates to broader funding formulas, inclusive and specific to special education.
Okay. And the other comment, it's not necessarily a question, but more so a comment. As we're going through this exercise, I do think, and I think we've have access in the past, but it would be helpful to get a breakdown of the budget in terms of how much is going towards direct student services versus administration versus staff and so forth. And then what I would say for this year, maybe take it a step further and try to get a comparison of our budget breakdown as it compares to alliance and non-alliance districts, right? So I want to, basically what I'm asking is, I want to see how we look from a year over year, right? In those categories, then how we look against a Bridgeport, New Haven, and then how we look with a Glastonbury or West Hartford.
And I think might be helpful to, are you asking non-ESSER fund budget? Because I'm wondering if, we would also need to consider their budget, ESSER allocation.
Well, my assumption is that we probably received more ESSER funding, right? So that, but I think just with the finance, I would leave it up to you. I think it's perfectly fine to capture the ESSER spending, but certainly make a note of, right, like that component. But for me, I just want to make sure that as a community, as we're looking at our budget, that we're allocating right capital in the appropriate way, and I think having some type of baseline comparison would be helpful for folks. Looking at the my screen here to see if anyone has any questions for the superintendent. I think she has another maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Ms. Brody, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, things are too hypothetical for me to really ask too much at this point, but can we have a list of all the stakeholder engagements and dates, please?
Absolutely.
That gave input on the budget.
Any other questions? Board Member Johnson, Board Member Ledger.
Yes, this is Board Member Ledger. I do have a question.
You have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the presentation thus far and the information. The question I have is with regards to the adult per student, ratio, if you will, the one adult per 18 18 point. So, students, can you refresh my memory? Foster, Mr. Foster?
Yes, yeah. So in K1 and 2, there it is on the screen. So it's 18.4 in K1 and 2. It is 21.6 students per teacher in 3rd to 6th, 22.4 students per teacher in 7th, 8th, and 21 students per teacher in 9th, 12th. So those are lower numbers than what you see in the sort of contractual class size limits. That's just a function of we can't staff them exactly at the class size limit because schools have to provide, not only the core subject and classroom teachers at the elementary, but also the specials teachers.
Right. Thank you so much. And how would that affect Montessori? Because in Montessori, there are 2 adults in the classroom. And that is part of the way the Montessori method works and the instruction is delivered and so on and so forth. So would that affect Montessori as well? Would you drop down to 1 adult in the classroom per 18 students?
No, so there is a adjustment in the formula for our Montessori schools that accounts for the 2 adults in the classroom. So the formula is calculated slightly differently for the Montessori schools to account for the 2 adults.
Okay, thank you so much.
Board Member Brody, I'm not sure if your hands are still raised or, well, actually, I'll come back to you. I think I heard Board Member Johnson.
Yeah, I have no questions at this moment. I'm just, reviewing this information and just trying to wrap my mind around it. So, no questions at this time.
Thank you. Board Member Brody, do you have another question?
Yes, so, Madam Superintendent, so I know, at least at my daughter's school, right, Montessori, they're able to, when they see the need, they're able to move the adult from room to room. When the staffing is not there, they'll know which room is in need at the time, and they have been shifting, when necessary, not the classroom teacher, but the assistant from, like, in the morning, you'll be here. They do a good job of knowing the need and able to shift that adult support from classroom to classroom. So I wanted to make that note, and I don't know if that will be helpful when we're thinking about how we can staff and what we're actually able to do. But I know they have been doing a very good job in doing that. And that's just from my student, when her favorite assistant is not in the classroom and somewhere else, but is well communicated to the students, because my student can tell me why her favorite miss, I won't say, is not, here or there, that they are making those adjustments in Montessori when necessary, because we're having issues with staff. I'm not saying Montessori has issues with staff, but just district-wide, we're having the issue with staff, and making those necessary adjustments when they actually have to.
I appreciate your comment. It makes me think about some of the I don't know if you would say, Deputy Foster and team, that they're trends, but I certainly have heard some of this from the one-on-one meetings that I've had with principals recently in terms of the flexibilities, right? And principals saying, we have the equity starter budget. Could I have flexibility if there is a position in the school that isn't listed, right, as one of those categories, but it's so important to the school, and it makes me wonder, Ms. Brody, if that could be the situation at your daughter's school, where, right, the leadership team would say, well, I might not need this position, but I definitely need, right, that assistant that is able to float, for lack of a better word, throughout the school based on need.
Yes, I would say that's very accurate.
Okay. I do want to echo a comment made by board member Brody earlier, and the superintendent. I'm not sure you're able to speak this. So I think this was very high level. I'm just thinking a cadence the next time we meet around the budget. I suspect that we'll be able to have more details and start looking at more kind of in-depth budgetary kind of components and so forth. I just want to make sure that let's just get a understanding of kind of like that's what next steps are. I think today was to level set and kind of paint the broad picture of what we're going to experience or potentially experience. And then I think the next set of conversations will get more granular in terms of some of those trade-offs that we talked about. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And an example of that is, some of the conversations that we're starting to have at the central office level, for example, right? We know that we have to think differently also with regard to how our central office is organized to identify potential efficiencies there. And so, yes, Chairman, that will include some of that thinking at the next meeting. Deputy Foster, anything else that you'd like to add?
Just to put a time horizon on it, I mean, our plan is that the January workshop meeting, we're going to be back and ideally are presenting you a first version of the budget. I would say that what we'll bring you in January will not be a fully balanced budget, but we will be able to be more specific about what are some cuts we think we could take, and then what a remaining deficit if we take those cuts. But yeah, we will be able to be more specific in January. And I think that your question about comparable and comparative data, I think we can bring that back at time as well.
Yeah, again, I think I heard comparative data and then also the stakeholder engagement, a list of the stakeholder engagement activities that led us to that will lead us to the conversation in January.
Yeah, and we can get you that list this week, so we can work with Ms. Santiago to send out the list of engagements.
Excellent. Are there any other further questions from my colleagues? The one thing I would say is, as you're getting information, again, I think the stakeholders fairly simple. When you think about the comparative analysis, if that information is ready before the workshop and when we meet again, I would encourage the team to send that out well in advance, or as well in advance as possible, for us to, as a board, to noodle on that and make sure that we come to these discussions prepared.
Very fair.
Yeah. Can I just, the one thing I want to offer is I 100% agree, and we will do our level best, and certainly things like the comparative data, we should be able to get you early. I just want to be really upfront and honest in saying that first workshop meeting is very early in January, and our finance team is going to work very hard to get a first pass at the budget done. But also, they are deserving of some holiday break with their family, and so I just want to acknowledge the timing will be challenging in terms of getting the full sort of proposed budget to you much in advance. We'll do our best as quickly as we can get it to you.
And we built a timeline. Oh, sorry.
I'll say there's nothing like exceeding expectations, right, Mr. Foster?
That's right.
we did build a timeline on the aggressive side, just to make sure that we had cushions throughout.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think anyone that's worked with me, like, I could certainly appreciate the work-life balance, but again, I very much expect folks to exceed expectations. So to the best of our ability, or more important, to the best of your ability, again, if we could get that information out in advance and folks have an opportunity to digest it, I think it would be super helpful. But I certainly make a note of the holiday season. All right. If there are no other questions and no other, I guess, presentation materials, I guess I will call this meeting to an end.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your time. Have a great evening, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Take care.
Right.